On the afternoon of August the 15th, 1944, a woman walked with deliberate calm toward the Gestapo headquarters in Digne, a sun-drenched town in the foothills of the French Alps. To any casual observer, she might have been a local woman on some mundane errand, perhaps delivering a petition or seeking information about a missing relative. Her simple summer dress and unassuming demeanor, a stark contrast to the grim stone edifice of the prison she approached. Yet, this woman was not a supplicant, nor was she French. Her name was Christina Skarbek, though she was known to her handlers in London as Christine Granville, and she was an agent of the British Special Operations Executive, a fact she had no intention of concealing. In her pocket, there was no concealed weapon, no cyanide pill for a last resort. Her arsenal for the coming confrontation consisted solely of a meticulously constructed narrative, an unshakable confidence in her own assessment of human weakness, and the crushing weight of an Allied invasion that was, at that very moment, beginning its assault on the southern coast of France. She was walking into a place from which few returned, not on a mission to kill or sabotage, but to engage in a form of psychological warfare so audacious and personal that its failure would mean not just her own excruciating death, but the decapitation of the entire Allied intelligence and resistance network in southeastern France, on the very day it was needed most. The strategic problem facing the SOE's F section, which oversaw operations in France, had crystallized into a catastrophic failure less than 48 hours prior. Francis Kammertz, known by the codename Roger, was not merely another agent. He was the architect and commander of the Jockey Circuit, a vast and highly effective resistance network that spanned from the Rhone Valley to the Italian border. His leadership was considered so indispensable that his superiors in London viewed him as the linchpin for the success of Operation Dragoon, the Allied landings in Provence designed to open a second front and trap German forces retreating from the Normandy campaign. Kammertz, along with two of his most trusted associates, Zan Fielding, another veteran SOE officer, and a French radio operator, had been stopped at a routine German checkpoint. A minor infraction, a lack of the correct travel permits, had escalated with terrifying speed into a full-blown security crisis when their identities were discovered. They were now prisoners in the Digne garrison, under the direct control of the local Gestapo, and their interrogation and scheduled execution were imminent. The loss of Kammertz would create a power vacuum that could not be filled, throwing the regional resistance into chaos at the precise moment coordinated action was paramount to support the invading Allied forces by sabotaging German communications, transport, and troop movements. Previous methods of resolving such crises were immediately rendered obsolete by the circumstances. A conventional military-style rescue operation was logistically impossible to mount on such short notice and with the available resources. The Digne prison was a formidable stone structure, heavily guarded by a mix of Wehrmacht soldiers and Gestapo security personnel who were already on high alert due to the escalating partisan activity in the region and the palpable tension of an impending invasion. Any armed assault would have been suicidal, resulting in a bloodbath and almost certainly guaranteeing the immediate execution of the prisoners to prevent their liberation. Furthermore, the SOE's operational doctrine was predicated on stealth and subtlety, not frontal assaults. An attempt to bribe a low-level guard or smuggle in a weapon would have been equally futile. The prisoners were high-value assets under the direct supervision of the Gestapo leadership, isolated from the general prison population and subject to the strictest security protocols. The intelligence from local Maquis contacts was chillingly clear. The interrogation had begun, and a decision for their execution was a matter of hours, not days. The standard operational playbook offered no solutions, and with the Allied fleet already approaching the coast, the window for any action was closing with suffocating finality. The situation demanded a response that was entirely outside the parameters of established doctrine. A solution that relied not on force of arms, but on a profound and terrifying gamble on human psychology. The core of the challenge was not merely the physical fortification of the Digna prison, but the intricate and opaque power structure within it. The man who held the fate of Kammerz and his men in his hands was an SS Hauptsturmführer, the ranking Gestapo officer in the sector. However, he did not operate in a vacuum. His authority was intertwined with that of the local Wehrmacht garrison commander, and more importantly, with a network of French collaborators and informers who provided the Gestapo with its operational intelligence. The challenge profile was therefore threefold. First, the physical security of the prison, which precluded any direct action. Second, the institutional fanaticism of the Gestapo, an organization ideologically committed to the ruthless suppression of resistance. And third, the specific psychological makeup of the individual commanders who held the keys. An intelligence picture had to be assembled with breathtaking speed, drawing on scraps of information from Maquis spies who worked as cleaners in the garrison, overheard conversations from nervous collaborators, and the general atmospheric intelligence gathered by the network Kammerz himself had built. The profile that began to emerge of the Gestapo commander was that of a man who was less of a true believer in the National Socialist cause and more of a career functionary, a bureaucrat of terror who was pragmatic, perhaps corruptible, and acutely aware of the shifting fortunes of war. It was this perceived crack in the ideological armor, this potential for self-preservation to override duty, that would become the central pivot point for any potential operation. The proposed solution, when it was conceived, was so unconventional that under normal circumstances it would have been dismissed as suicidally reckless. The plan was for a single, unarmed agent to walk directly into the Gestapo headquarters, demand a meeting with the commander, and negotiate the release of the prisoners. This agent would not use a cover story or a disguise. On the contrary, she would openly declare her identity as a British officer. The entire strategy was predicated on transforming a position of profound weakness into one of psychological dominance. The agent would not be a supplicant begging for mercy, but an emissary of an imminently victorious power, offering the German commander a one-time opportunity to save his own life. The plan required an operative of almost superhuman nerve, an individual capable of projecting absolute authority and conviction while standing on the precipice of torture and execution. It was a bluff of monumental proportions, where the stakes were not chips on a table but human lives and the strategic success of a major military campaign. The agent chosen for this task, the only one in the region with the requisite blend of audacity, linguistic fluency, and psychological acumen, was Christine Granville. Her superiors, receiving the plan via a crackling radio transmission, authorized it with grave reluctance, fully aware that they were likely sending one of their finest agents to her death. The obstacles to this audacious plan were numerous and seemingly insurmountable, each one a potential point of catastrophic failure. The most immediate risk was that Granville would be arrested and shot on sight the moment she identified herself as a British agent, a standard procedure for dealing with captured spies. Even if she secured an audience with the commander, her bluff could be called at any moment. A single question she could not answer, a flicker of fear in her eyes, or a subordinate officer with more fanatical zeal could shatter the entire charade. The commander could feign agreement only to have her arrested after she revealed her hand, using her as leverage or simply torturing her for information about the local networks before executing her along with the others. Furthermore, the plan required a delicate balance in its execution. She needed to appear powerful enough to be credible, but not so threatening as to provoke an immediate, violent response. The linguistic and cultural barriers were also significant. Although fluent in French and German, she had to navigate the specific jargon and psychological tics of a Nazi security officer. Understanding his mindset, his fears, and his potential motivations with perfect clarity. The entire operation hinged on her ability to accurately read and manipulate a man she had never met, in an environment designed to intimidate and destroy individuals far more powerful than a lone, unarmed woman. The technological and tactical preparation for an operation of this nature was minimalist and centered almost entirely on intelligence rather than equipment. There were no custom-built gadgets or specialized weapons. Granville's primary tool was a meticulously assembled file of information, a dossier of psychological leverage. Before her approach to Digne, she and the remaining elements of the jockey circuit worked frantically to gather every available piece of intelligence. They confirmed the precise identities of the prisoners to ensure there was no mistake. They compiled a list of local French collaborators, particularly the liaison officer who worked directly with the Gestapo commander, a man of questionable loyalty who could potentially be used as a pressure point. Most critically, they used their sources to build a psychological profile of the commander himself. They learned he was an Austrian, not German, a detail that might suggest a less ingrained ideological commitment. They gathered rumors of his pragmatism and his growing anxiety about the advancing Allied forces. The only piece of tangible equipment was a large sum of money, 2 million francs, which had been set aside for operational emergencies. This was not intended as a simple bribe, but as a facilitator, a concrete symbol of the deal being offered, a transactional element that could ground the high-stakes psychological drama in the familiar territory of corrupt self-interest. The money made the offer of survival tangible, a physical down payment on a post-war life. The operative herself was the product of years of rigorous selection, training, and brutal field experience. Krystyna Skarbek was born into Polish aristocracy, a countess whose early life of privilege belied a fiercely independent and rebellious spirit. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, she was in Africa with her husband. She immediately traveled to London and volunteered her services to the British war effort, driven by a visceral hatred for the invaders who had subjugated her homeland. Her sharp intellect, linguistic skills, she was fluent in Polish, French, and English, and had a strong command of German. And her remarkable composure under pressure made her a prime candidate for the newly formed Special Operations Executive. At the SOE's training schools in Scotland and the New Forest, she underwent a transformation, stripping away the vestiges of her former life and forging a new identity as a clandestine operative. She was trained in the arts of silent killing, sabotage with plastic explosives, Morse code, the use of single-use cryptographic pads, and the tradecraft of running agent networks, establishing cutouts, using dead drops, and detecting and evading surveillance. More than the physical skills, however, her training focused on psychological conditioning, on the ability to lie with absolute conviction, to compartmentalize fear, and to adopt and inhabit a cover identity so completely that it would withstand the most intense scrutiny. Her early operations served as a crucible, hardening her skills and cementing her reputation for almost reckless bravery. Her first missions took her into Hungary and back to her native Poland, skiing over the treacherous Tatra Mountains in the dead of winter to act as a courier, smuggling funds, intelligence, and instructions to the nascent Polish resistance. It was during these operations that she first demonstrated her extraordinary talent for improvisation and psychological manipulation. On one occasion, when stopped by German border guards, she feigned symptoms of tuberculosis, coughing blood from a deliberately bitten tongue, playing on the guard's fear of the disease to avoid a more thorough search that would have revealed incriminating documents. In another instance, facing arrest with a fellow agent in Budapest, she displayed her British passport, a document that should have guaranteed her immediate imprisonment, and with an air of indignant authority, berated the Hungarian police for inconveniencing an ally of Germany. A bluff so audacious that the confused officers released them. These experiences taught her that rules could be bent, that fear was a weapon that could be turned against her enemies, and that the projection of absolute confidence was often more effective than any firearm. By the time she was parachuted into France in July 1944 to work with the jockey circuit, she was a seasoned veteran, her psychological resilience forged in the fire of some of the war's most dangerous clandestine battlefields. The construction of a cover identity for this specific operation was a unique and paradoxical exercise in tradecraft. Normally, an agent's legend was a painstakingly fabricated backstory, complete with false papers, a plausible history, and a mundane reason for being in a specific location, all designed to conceal their true affiliation. For the Digna operation, Granville inverted this principle entirely. Her cover was the unvarnished truth. She was Christine Granville, an agent of the British government, a field officer operating under the direct command of the Allied High Command. The legend she constructed was not one of a civilian, but of a figure of immense and imminent power. This identity was reinforced by a series of carefully chosen details and behaviors. She would not approach the prison furtively, but would walk directly to the main entrance in broad daylight. She would not request to see the commander, she would demand it. Her entire posture, tone of voice, and choice of words were rehearsed to project an aura of absolute, non-negotiable authority. She was banking on the psychological principle that such a direct and seemingly suicidal approach was so far outside the expected behavior of a captured spy that it would create a moment of cognitive dissonance in her adversaries, a window of confusion and uncertainty that she could exploit. Her identity was not a shield to hide behind, but a weapon to be wielded, its credibility resting entirely on the strength of her will and the undeniable strategic reality that the German war machine in France was collapsing around the very men she intended to confront. The operation moved into its active phase as Granville began her journey towards Digne. This was not a simple insertion into a hostile environment. She was already deep within it, a known agent operating without the safety of an established safe house in the immediate vicinity. Her approach was a calculated performance from the moment she entered the town's outskirts. She moved with a purpose that discouraged questions, her gaze fixed forward, her pace steady. She observed the atmosphere of the town, noting the nervous energy of the French gendarmerie, the sullen demeanor of the German soldiers on patrol, and the hurried, anxious movements of the civilian population. This was the final stage of intelligence gathering, a real-time atmospheric analysis to confirm her strategic assumptions. The tension was palpable. The rumors of the Allied landings were clearly spreading, creating a backdrop of fear and uncertainty that was essential for her plan to succeed. Every step she took towards the prison was a step deeper into a situation from which there was no retreat. The final buildup was internal, a process of mental fortification, of suppressing the primal fear that would have paralyzed a lesser individual and replacing it with a cold, focused resolve. She reviewed the key points of her argument, the names of the collaborators she would use as leverage, the precise phrasing of her threats and promises, transforming her fear into fuel for the confrontation to come. Upon reaching the prison, a converted barracks, she did not hesitate. She walked past the sentries at the outer gate, who were momentarily taken aback by her directness. and entered the main building. Inside, she was confronted by a duty officer at a heavy wooden desk. It was here that the performance began in earnest. In fluent German, she stated her name and rank, falsely claiming to be a niece of General Montgomery to add a layer of personal connection to the Allied command, and demanded to see the commanding officer on a matter of urgent and mutual importance. The sheer audacity of the request, made by an unaccompanied woman in a place where such demands were unheard of, created the desired confusion. The officer, trained to respond to threats of force or subterfuge, was procedurally unprepared for a threat delivered through an assertion of diplomatic-style privilege. He made a telephone call, his voice a mixture of disbelief and caution. Granville was told to wait. This period was perhaps the most dangerous phase of the operation. It was a moment of maximum vulnerability, where her fate rested on the internal debate happening in the commander's office. She stood in the bleak corridor, projecting an air of impatient nonchalance, as if the delay were a mere bureaucratic inconvenience, while every instinct screamed at the immense, immediate danger of her position. After a wait that stretched for what felt like an eternity but was likely only minutes, she was escorted into the commander's office. The room was Spartan, functional, dominated by a large desk behind which sat the SS Hauptsturmführer. He was a man in his 40s, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of stern professionalism that barely concealed the weariness and strain of his position. He was not alone. With him was the Belgian liaison officer, a collaborator whose presence Granville had anticipated. The psychological battle commenced without preamble. The commander asked who she was. Granville began her carefully rehearsed narrative, laying out her identity as a British agent. She watched his reaction closely, seeing no immediate move to call the guards, only a flicker of intense, calculating curiosity. She explained, in calm and measured tones, that she had not come to plead, but to offer him a proposition. She informed him that the Allied landings had begun that morning, a fact he likely suspected but may not have had confirmed, and that the full-scale invasion of southern France was underway. She stated that Digne would be liberated within days, if not hours, and that the Maquis, under the command of the men he held in his cells, were already preparing to seal off the town. This was the moment of truth, the point where her bluff would either be accepted or violently rejected. She pressed her advantage, shifting from the strategic to the personal. She informed the commander that his name, along with that of the liaison officer, was on a list of war criminals compiled by Allied intelligence. She explained that when the town fell, there would be no orderly surrender for them, only summary justice at the hands of the resistance fighters they had spent months hunting and torturing. She painted a vivid and terrifying picture of their inevitable fate. Then, having established the threat, she presented the alternative. She was, she claimed, the only person who could save them. If they released the 3 prisoners into her custody, unharmed, she would personally guarantee them safe conduct through the Allied lines. She would provide them with official protection and ensure they were treated as prisoners of war, not as criminals to be executed. To the collaborator, she offered a chance to mitigate his treason, to perform one act that might weigh in his favor when the day of reckoning arrived. It was he who wavered first, his face visibly paling. His fear acted as a catalyst, subtly undermining the commander's own composure. The commander hesitated, his mind clearly racing as he processed the impossible situation. He was weighing his duty to the Reich against his instinct for self-preservation. Granville sensed his indecision and played her final card. She mentioned the 2 million francs. She presented it not as a crude bribe to a loyal officer, but as a practical consideration for a man who would soon be a fugitive. It was, she explained, compensation for the risks he was taking and a fund to help him start a new life. The money was the crucial element that transitioned the offer from an abstract promise of survival to a concrete, transactional deal. It provided a rationalization, a way for him to frame his actions not as treason, but as a pragmatic business decision. The commander remained silent for a long moment, the tension in the room becoming almost unbearable. He conferred in a low voice with the liaison officer, whose fear was now palpable. Finally, the commander looked back at Granville. Without emotion, he stated his condition. The prisoners must be released immediately, and they must all be gone from Digna within 2 hours. He would arrange for their exit from the prison to look like a routine transfer. Granville had won. Her assessment of his character had been correct. Faced with the certainty of the Reich's collapse and the promise of personal survival, his loyalty had evaporated. The extraction was as surreal as the negotiation. There was no dramatic firefight or high-speed chase. Granville, accompanied by the visibly shaken liaison officer, was led down to the cells. Kemmerts, Fielding, and the radio operator, who had been preparing themselves for their execution, looked up in stunned disbelief as the door swung open and they were told they were free to go. They were escorted out of the prison and through the main gates, walking past the same guards who, hours earlier, had been their captors. The feeling was one of profound unreality, the air thick with the unspoken threat that at any second an order would be shouted, and they would be shot in the back. But the order never came. They walked calmly through the streets of Digna, a small, quiet procession moving away from the heart of enemy power. Granville maintained her composed exterior, but the immense psychological strain of the preceding hours was beginning to take its toll. They did not stop until they had reached the relative safety of the hills outside the town, where they linked up with a Maquis reception party. Only then, once the prisoners were truly free and the immediate danger had passed, did the mask of icy control finally slip, the enormity of what she had just accomplished crashing down upon her. The immediate consequence of the operation was the preservation of the jockey circuit's command structure at a moment of supreme strategic importance. With Kemmerts back in command, the resistance networks in southeastern France were able to execute their pre-planned missions to support Operation Dragoon, harassing German convoys, sabotaging railway lines, and providing critical intelligence to the advancing Allied armies. The success of the Digny operation had a direct and measurable impact on the speed and efficiency of the Allied advance through Provence. The long-term strategic value was less tangible, but equally significant. The story of Granville's bluff became a legend within the SOE, a textbook example of how intelligence, psychological acuity, and individual courage could achieve what a battalion of soldiers could not. It reinforced the core tenets of irregular warfare, that the vulnerabilities of an enemy are not always physical, and that the human mind can be the most critical battlefield. The operation became a case study in the power of unconventional thinking, a demonstration that the most audacious plans, while carrying the highest risks, could also yield the most spectacular rewards. The political and diplomatic repercussions of the operation were complex and morally ambiguous. True to her word, Granville ensured that the Gestapo commander and the collaborator were given a degree of protection. This aspect of the deal was quietly honored by the Allied authorities, who recognized the immense value of the lives she had saved. The men who had been responsible for the torture and murder of French resistance fighters were spared the summary justice they would have otherwise faced, a morally troubling but pragmatically necessary price for the rescue of Kemmerts. This outcome highlighted the often uncomfortable compromises inherent in intelligence work, where clear-cut distinctions between right and wrong become blurred by operational necessity. The affair raised difficult questions about the nature of justice in wartime and the ethical calculus that intelligence services must employ when the lives of key assets and the success of major military campaigns hang in the balance. There was no easy answer, only the stark reality that, in the clandestine world, victory often required deals with the devil. For Christine Granville, the psychological cost of her service was profound. The Digno operation was the apotheosis of her wartime career, an act of singular bravery that placed her in the pantheon of SOE legends. However, the same qualities that allowed her to walk into a Gestapo prison unarmed, her intense self-reliance, her emotional compartmentalization, and her comfort with extreme risk, made it difficult for her to transition back to a life of peace. The war had been a period of intense, life-affirming purpose, a black-and-white struggle where her actions had clear and immediate meaning. The post-war world seemed gray and mundane by comparison. She was awarded the George Medal and the French Croix de Guerre for her heroism, but official recognition could not fill the void left by the cessation of the conflict. Like many clandestine operatives, she found herself adrift, an individual forged for a world that no longer existed. Her post-war life was marked by a series of menial jobs and a sense of restless dislocation, a tragic and poignant coda to her extraordinary wartime service. Her life ended not in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, but tragically, in a London hotel in 1952, murdered by a spurned and obsessed admirer. It was a senseless and banal end for a woman who had faced down the very worst of humanity with nothing but her wits and her courage. A final, bitter irony for one of the Second World War's most remarkable and unsung heroes. In the final analysis, the Digna operation stands as a testament to a form of warfare that is rarely seen and seldom understood. It was a victory achieved not through overwhelming force or technological superiority, but through the precise application of psychological pressure on a single, vulnerable point in the enemy's command structure. Christine Granville's weapon was her profound understanding of human nature, her ability to see past the uniform and the ideology to the frightened, self-interested man beneath. She understood that, in the final calculus of a losing war, the instinct for personal survival would almost always triumph over abstract notions of duty and loyalty. Her actions on that August afternoon were not merely brave. They were a masterclass in the art of intelligence, a perfect synthesis of information, analysis, and execution. She demonstrated that a single, well-informed individual, armed with an unshakable belief in their own assessment, could alter the course of events as surely as any army. Her story is a stark reminder that in the shadow wars fought by organizations like the SOE, the most potent weapon is not the one that fires a bullet, but the one that can infiltrate and conquer the human mind. Was Christine Granville's deal with a Gestapo officer a justifiable act of wartime pragmatism or an unforgivable compromise with evil? Can a single heroic act, however successful, wash away the moral ambiguity of protecting a war criminal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.